The moment I walked into the hospital's third-floor conference room and saw her sitting at the head of the table, I stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. She was wearing a charcoal blazer with a hospital lanyard I didn't recognize. Her silver hair pulled back the same way it had been 3 weeks ago when she was sitting alone in the cafeteria, staring at her phone like it had personally offended her. The reading glasses were the same. The quiet, measured way she looked up at me when I stepped through the door that was the same too. But the 4 people sitting on either side of her, including my director and the head of human resources, were very much not part of anything I had expected to walk into that morning. She looked at me with no expression I could read. Then she said, simply, "Please sit down." I sat down. 3 weeks earlier, I had been 40 minutes into a 12-hour shift and running on a gas station, coffee, and 4 hours of sleep. That was a normal Tuesday. I worked the cardiac step-down unit on the 4th floor, and if you've never spent a Tuesday on a cardiac step-down unit, I'll describe it for you. Controlled chaos with a paperwork problem. We were chronically short-staffed. The supply room was perpetually missing half of what we needed, and the one functional IV pump that didn't alarm every 8 minutes was treated like a sacred object. But that Tuesday morning I had a 45-minute overlap before my patients came back from their procedures, and I did something I almost never did. I went downstairs to the cafeteria and sat down with actual food that wasn't eaten standing over a sink. I was halfway through a bowl of oatmeal when I noticed her. She was sitting 2 tables away, alone, a tray in front of her with a cup of soup and a small plate of crackers. She had her phone out and she was squinting at the screen, tilting it slightly, then tilting it back. I recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look my grandmother used to get whenever a website asked her to simply verify her identity by clicking a box, entering a code sent to an email address she hadn't opened in 4 years, and then answering a security question about the name of her first pet. I watched her try twice to tap something on the screen. Then she looked up and flagged down the cashier. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, not embarrassed yet, just matter of fact. "I believe I'm having some trouble with the payment." The cashier was a young woman who was trying very hard to be patient. She explained that the cafeteria had switched to a new digital payment system 2 weeks ago and that cash was no longer accepted at the register. The card reader was also, as of that morning, experiencing what she called intermittent issues. The woman at the table nodded slowly. "I see. And is there another way?" "You can try the app," the cashier said, "but you'd have to download it and set up an account." There was a pause. The woman looked back at her phone. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm afraid I don't know how to do that here." No one moved to help her. The cashier looked sorry but helpless. The 2 people behind her in the line shifted. There was that specific silence that falls over a room when someone is struggling and everyone else has somewhere else to be. I pushed back my chair. I walked up to the register, pulled out my badge-linked staff account card, the one that lets hospital employees charge meals to their payroll, and handed it to the cashier before the woman at the table could look up and realize what was happening. "I've got it," I said, keeping my eyes on the cashier. "Oh no, please, I couldn't let you," the woman started. "It's already done," I said. I smiled at her briefly. The way you smile at someone when you want to communicate that this is absolutely not a big deal and there's no reason to make it one. "Enjoy the soup." Then I went back to my table, finished my oatmeal in about 4 minutes, and went back upstairs to work. I didn't think about it again. Honestly, I didn't. It was $7.40. She was a woman who reminded me of my grandmother. The cafeteria was cold and the soup was hot, and that was the end of the story, as far as I was concerned. What I didn't know was that she sat there for another 20 minutes after I left, that she asked the cashier my name, that the cashier, who didn't know my name but recognized my face, pointed out my department badge color and said I worked somewhere upstairs. I also didn't know who she was. That part would become relevant later. The problems with my charge nurse had started about 4 months before the cafeteria morning, though, if I'm being honest, there had always been a low-grade friction between us from the day I transferred to that unit. I had come from a larger teaching hospital in another state, and I think she found that threatening in a way she never said out loud but expressed constantly in smaller ways. The schedule assignments, the way she distributed the harder patient loads, the meetings she forgot to include me in. None of it was dramatic enough to report. That's the thing about that particular kind of workplace behavior. It lives in the space just below the threshold of anything you can put in writing. She never said anything outright cruel. She was never unprofessional in front of witnesses. What she did was quieter and more persistent than that, and it accumulated the way water pressure accumulates before something gives. The first real thing happened in February. I had flagged a potential medication interaction for one of my patients, an elderly man on cardiac meds whose new prescription from the attending hadn't been cross-checked against his existing regimen. I caught it during my chart review, brought it to the attending, and the medication order was changed. Straightforward. The kind of thing nurses are trained to catch, and do catch, every day, in hospitals across the country. 2 days later, my charge nurse presented the case in our department meeting as an example of proactive patient care. She used the word we. She described what the team had noticed. She never said my name. I let it go. The second thing happened 6 weeks later. I was assigned 4 patients on a night when we were down 2 nurses, which meant I was effectively covering 6 beds, with help from an aide who was also covering 6 other beds. One of my patients deteriorated around 2 in the morning. I handled it. I got the rapid response team. I communicated with the on-call physician. I documented everything. The patient was transferred to the ICU and was stable by morning. When I came back for my next shift, there was a note in my file. My charge nurse had flagged my documentation from that night as incomplete and delayed. The note said my charting had not reflected real-time status updates during the deterioration event. My charting had been thorough. I had time-stamped entries every 7 minutes during the critical window. I knew this because I had gone back and read every entry twice before I left that morning, exactly because I knew how these things worked. I requested a meeting. She reviewed the note with me calmly, told me she understood it had been a difficult night, and suggested I think of this as a learning opportunity. I did not find it a learning opportunity. I found it a flag on my record that didn't belong there. My colleague, my closest friend on that floor, a nurse who'd been there for 11 years and had seen more political weather than most, told me over lunch one afternoon that this was a pattern, that 2 other nurses had left the unit in the past 18 months, that one of them had filed a complaint with HR before she transferred out, that nothing had changed. "You have 2 choices," she told me, unwrapping a sandwich with the calm efficiency of someone who had made peace with a situation long ago. "You outlast her, or you leave. There's a third option," I said. She looked at me. "There isn't," she said. "Not in this hospital. Not with this administration. I'm telling you that as someone who cares about you." I heard her. I didn't entirely believe her, but I heard her. The third thing happened on a Wednesday morning in March, exactly 11 days after the cafeteria. I was called into my charge nurse's office before my shift began. She had a printed form on the desk in front of her. She slid it toward me and told me to read it. It was a formal written complaint. It alleged that I had improperly accessed a patient's chart on a date I was not scheduled to work, that I had reviewed sensitive information without clinical justification, and that I had failed to report a near-miss medication event in a timely manner. The medication event listed was from 6 weeks prior. The patient whose chart I had allegedly accessed was someone I had cared for 2 weeks before, and the date listed was a Sunday when I had, in fact, been in the building. I had come in on my day off to drop off a personal item for a colleague, and had briefly looked at the chart because I'd had a handoff concern I forgot to communicate before my last shift ended. None of what she'd written was entirely fabricated. That was what made it effective. It was assembled from real fragments, distorted just enough. "I'd like to respond to each of these points in writing," I said. "Of course," she said. "HR will be in touch to schedule a formal review." I walked out of her office and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went and found my colleague and told her what had just happened. She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "I really am." "I didn't do anything wrong," I said. "I know," she said. "That doesn't always matter." The HR meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I spent the days in between doing what I always did, showing up, doing my job, caring for my patients, documenting everything with a level of precision that probably would have been exhausting if I weren't running entirely on adrenaline and stubbornness. I pulled every chart entry, every timestamp, every communication log I had access to. I wrote a 12-page response. I told exactly one other person outside the hospital, my mother, who listened without interrupting and then said, "You know what you did and didn't do. That's what matters." It was the kind of thing mothers say that sounds simple and isn't. I did not sleep well. I did not know that 4 floors above where I worked, in a temporary office that had been quietly assigned to her for the duration of a 6-week engagement. The woman from the cafeteria was working through a stack of reports that included, among many other things, the personnel records of every charge nurse in the building. I did not know she had been contracted by the hospital's board to conduct a comprehensive review of patient care standards, staff retention, and departmental leadership across all clinical floors. I didn't know her background. I didn't know her name. I didn't know she'd spent 30 years in healthcare administration, the last 12 as the chief patient safety officer for a regional hospital network that covered 9 facilities. I didn't know any of that. What I knew was that at 8:47 on a Thursday morning, I walked into a conference room on the 3rd floor expecting to sit across from 2 HR representatives and my charge nurse, and instead found myself looking at a table of 6 people, one of whom was the woman I'd bought soup for 3 weeks ago. She was sitting at the head of the table. She waited until I was seated. Then she introduced herself, her full name and her title, which I won't repeat here because this story isn't about titles. What I will say is that by the time she finished speaking, I understood completely why the director of my department was sitting with her hands folded very carefully in her lap. "We're going to handle this meeting a little differently than what you may have been expecting," she said, looking at me directly. "I want to be transparent with you about why." She explained that over the past 3 weeks, as part of her review, she had examined the departmental records for my unit. She had reviewed scheduling data, incident reports, chart documentation logs, and HR complaints filed over the past 2 years. She had also, she said, conducted informal conversations with multiple staff members across the floor. "What I found," she said, setting a folder open on the table in front of her, "is a pattern of complaint filings that correlates very specifically with nurses who have raised patient care concerns or who have demonstrated independent clinical decision-making that was not initiated by unit leadership." The room was quiet. 3 complaints in 18 months, she continued. 2 of the nurses named have since transferred out. You are the 3rd. She looked at me steadily. I didn't say anything. "I've reviewed your documentation from the events cited in the complaint against you," she said. "I've also reviewed the original incident reports, the chart timestamps, and the rapid response record from the night in question." She paused. "Your documentation is thorough. Your clinical judgment in each instance was sound. The characterizations in the complaint against you are not consistent with the objective record." Someone on the HR side of the table shifted in their chair. "This meeting," she said, "is not a disciplinary hearing. The complaint filed against you is being withdrawn and will be expunged from your personnel record." I became aware, suddenly, that my hands were very still in my lap. I had been bracing for so long that I didn't know what to do with the absence of something to brace against. "As for the broader personnel matter," she continued, "that will be addressed separately and through the appropriate process. It won't be addressed in this room, with you present, because that's not how it should be done." She said it simply, without drama, just as a statement of fact. "The way you'd say the sky is blue." I thought about the comment I'd read somewhere once that the best leaders handle discipline privately, not as a performance. She was doing exactly that. Before she closed the folder, she looked at me one more time. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like acknowledgement. "Is there anything you want to say?" she asked. There were about 11 things I wanted to say, some of them professional and some of them considerably less so. I sorted through them quickly. "No," I said. "Thank you." She nodded once. "You're free to return to your shift." I stood up, collected my folder, the 12-page response I never got to use, and walked out of the conference room. I made it to the elevator before my hands started shaking. My colleague found me at the nursing station 20 minutes later. She took one look at my face and steered me toward the break room. I told her everything, quietly and quickly, watching her expression move through surprise and then something that looked a lot like relief. "Who is she?" my colleague asked. "Someone the board brought in," I said. "I don't know how long she's been here, and she just handled it." She said the complaint was being withdrawn. My colleague was quiet for a moment. "And the other thing? Handled separately," I said. "I don't know what that means yet." I found out what it meant about 2 weeks later, when the unit schedule came out and my charge nurse was no longer listed as charge nurse. She had been reassigned to a different role in a different department. No announcement was made. No explanation was offered. If you blinked, you might have missed the change entirely. That's how it happened. Not with a scene, not with a confrontation in front of witnesses. Just quietly, the way anything real gets done. My colleague, when she saw the schedule, walked past my station and set a cup of coffee on the desk in front of me without saying a word. I picked it up. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. I saw the woman one more time before she finished her engagement at the hospital. I was coming off a shift, still in my scrubs, and I passed her in the main lobby near the front entrance. She was with 2 other people, all of them in professional clothes, clearly wrapping something up. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. She excused herself from the conversation and walked over. "I heard you had a good week," she said. "I did," I said. She nodded. "Good." She started to turn back toward her group. Then she stopped. "The cafeteria," she said. Not a question. "The soup was good that day," I said. Something moved across her face that I can only describe as the kind of smile a person gives when they've made a decision a long time ago about how they want to move through the world, and they're at peace with it. "Yes," she said. "It was." Then she went back to her colleagues, and I walked out to the parking garage, and that was the last time I saw her. I've thought about that morning in the cafeteria many times since. Not because of what came after it, though that's the part that makes the story. I know. I've thought about it because of the 7 seconds between when I saw her struggling and when I decided to get up. 7 seconds isn't a long time, but it's long enough to talk yourself out of something, long enough to calculate whether it's worth the awkwardness, whether someone else will step in, whether you have places to be and things to finish and enough of your own problems already. Thank you very much. Long enough to make the easier choice, which is the one where you look away and finish your oatmeal. I didn't look away. I don't say that to make myself sound heroic. I want to be clear about that. It was $7.40 and a 30-second interaction on a Tuesday morning when I had 40 minutes between procedures and happened to be paying attention. The bar was not high, but I've been in enough situations, on that floor and before it, to know that the bar being low doesn't mean people always clear it. Sometimes the cafeteria stays quiet, and the woman with the soup just doesn't eat lunch. Sometimes the chart flag stays in the file, and the nurse who caught the medication error doesn't work there anymore. Sometimes the pattern continues because no one is in the right place at the right time, paying the right kind of attention. She was. I happened to be too. The Marine Corps, or so I've been told by friends who served, has a saying about bearing. The way you carry yourself when no one is watching. The composure you maintain not because you're performing it for anyone, but because it's simply who you are when things get hard. I'm not a Marine. I'm a nurse in a hospital in a mid-sized city who buys soup for strangers sometimes and documents chart entries very carefully and tries, most days, to be the kind of person my patients need me to be, even when the shift is long and the supply room is empty and there's a flag on my record that shouldn't be there. I think about something she said in that conference room, almost as an aside, before we got to the formal part of the meeting. She said, "The reason we review records isn't to catch people doing something wrong. It's to find out whether the people doing something right have what they need to keep doing it." I wrote it down afterward, in the margin of my 12-page response that I never had to use. I've looked at it a few times since. I think she meant it about more than hospital audits. My mother asked me, months later, what I'd learned from the whole thing. We were on the phone on a Sunday and I was folding laundry and only half paying attention, and she asked it the way she asks most important questions, like it was the most natural question in the world. I thought about it for a minute. That doing the right thing and being recognized for it are 2 different things, I said. And you can't control the second one. But you can control the first one. Every single time. My mother was quiet. Then she said, "That's right. I think I already knew it," I said. "But I know it differently now." That felt true. There's knowing something in the part of your brain where you keep ideas, and there's knowing it in the part where you keep the things that have actually happened to you. The second kind is slower to get there, but it stays. I'm still on that floor. The new charge nurse is someone who came up through the unit, someone my colleague has worked beside for 7 years and speaks about with uncomplicated respect. The shift load is still difficult. The supply room is still missing things. I still run on gas station coffee more often than I should. But I go down to the cafeteria sometimes, when I have a window, and I sit with actual food, and I pay attention. That part I'm keeping.